We have with us this morning Dr. Manisha Sinha. She is a professor and chair of history at the University of Connecticut, here to talk to us about her book, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic. Good morning, Dr. Sinha.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
The premise of your book, that Reconstruction starts in 1861 with the start of the Civil War and is completed with the passage of the Women's Right to Vote Amendment in 1919. Nobody has conceived of Reconstruction as falling within the scope of that. What prompted you to think of pulling all these themes together to extend the definition of Reconstruction?
Yes, that's a great question and a good opening one because usually when we think of Reconstruction and the way it's taught in American history textbooks, is a brief period immediately after the Civil War, which is then overthrown by 1877, with the so-called Compromise of 1877, when the last Reconstruction state governments fall in the South, with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes to the presidency. And, historians dispute whether there was even a formal compromise then, right now. And I think by looking at just confining our vision just to that brief period, we have missed the significance of Reconstruction, which was to lay the basis of a modern interracial democracy. It is true that previous historians, beginning with the great activist and scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, his landmark book in the 1930s, Black Reconstruction, had really challenged the so-called Dunning School, which was a sort of pro-Southern continuation of the lost cause mythology of the Civil War view of Reconstruction as a terrible time of federal tyranny and Black misrule that achieved nothing. That view had been completely overturned beginning in the Second World War, starting with Du Bois, Second World War with historians like Kenneth Stamp and John Hope Franklin, and then my own mentor, Eric Foner, who published the book on Reconstruction in the 1980s, talked about the achievements of Reconstruction. But all these books, unlike Du Bois, by the way, had this very narrow chronological timeline for Reconstruction. And because it was so narrow, I think they miss both the achievements of Reconstruction, but also the tragedy of its long unwinding. So I'm not saying that Reconstruction continued until 1920 when the 19th Amendment is passed. But I am saying that we have to look at the long unwinding of Reconstruction from 1877 to 1920 and view the 19th Amendment, the Women's Suffrage Amendment, as a continuation of Reconstruction's progressive constitutionalism. Because if you look at the wording of that amendment, it is based on the 15th Amendment that gave Black men the right to vote. I made this argument in the book, those of you who've read it. I also begin my story of Reconstruction much earlier than most books. I begin with the election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency in 1860, which led to the secession of the Deep South states. That's when I argue the first American Republic fell. Because the Union was dissolved by South Carolina, and quickly the Deep South states followed in succession, and after Fort Sumter, some of the Upper South states. So it was really important for me to show that the grounding for Reconstruction, or the rise of what I call the Second American Republic, was already being put into place with the exit of Southern slaveholders in the Southern slave states, most of them, not all of them, most of them from the Union, and that really, if you look at the policies of the Lincoln administration during the Civil War, you can see how the groundwork was being laid for Reconstruction. The most important, of course, is the passage of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery that unleashes the forces of constitutional change. This is why contemporaries and many American historians have referred to the Civil War and Reconstruction as the Second American Revolution or the Second Founding. I call it the Second American Republic. And I thought in order to tell that entire story, I needed that long time frame. I'm not saying that Reconstruction continues until 1920, but saying that we really need to look at the process of the unwinding of Reconstruction also, and not just its brief triumph, to understand its importance in U.S. history.
Another element of the intriguing premise in the book is that you say it was the fall of the Second American Republic rather than its success that paved the way for the global empire built on the Southern dream to perpetuate racial subordination. Speak a little bit more about that, please.
Yes, so many historians before me had come up with this notion of the Greater Reconstruction. This is mainly historians of the West and of Native America who looked at the complete conquest of the West in the 19th century by the United States and the end of indigenous sovereignty in the West. And their time frame was, in my opinion, a little odd. They called it the Greater Reconstruction, and they said we need to go back to the Mexican War of 1846 to really look at the acquisition of the Southwest, which ends with the last Indian War in 1877, which coincided in their mind with the end of Reconstruction. And the historian Elliot West is most associated with this thesis. I like their framework of expanding the chronology of Reconstruction and of including the story of the West, but I don't agree with them that we can extend the boundaries of Reconstruction back to the Mexican War. What I do argue in the book is that during the first American Republic, right, the one founded in 1776, the republic quickly becomes an empire for slavery. Slaveholders, inordinate power in the federal government. And by the mid 19th century, you have the emergence of Lincoln saying, are we a republic or are we going to be an authoritarian, autocratic state like Russia? And he says, when it comes to that, I would rather live in an openly authoritarian state than a hypocritical republic that adopts authoritarian ideas. So how did that happen? The empire for slavery. How did pro-slavery imperialism progress is something that many historians, including myself, in my first book, have written about. It's the Louisiana Purchase, the annexation of Texas, and of course, which led directly to the war with Mexico, and then the basically acquisition of all this enormous landmass in the Southwest, which I say was part of pro-slavery imperialism. Now, I see the Civil War and Reconstruction as a break in that story, because once Lincoln is elected, his notion of forming alliances with anti-slavery republics throughout the Americas and being a good neighbor flips that slavery expansionism, imperialism, including in the 1850s with, filibustering, which was the illegal invasions of Nicaragua and Cuba, and all these plans to just annex territory in Central America and elsewhere, which is back in vogue, I believe now. But Lincoln really opposed those. His administration gave a lot of moral support to Benito Juarez's attempt to get rid of the French puppet emperor in Mexico. He wanted alliances with Argentina. He had plans to colonize Black people to Central America and to Haiti. In fact, they actually tried that in Chiriquí in Panama, but he never planned to annex that territory. I think this was one of the questions that Debbie sent me. Lincoln was far from an imperialist. And during Reconstruction, our relationship with the Western nations, with Grant's peace policy, let us have peace, he tried to change the history of warfare and massacres that had taken place earlier. Unfortunately, his peace policy also does not succeed, and by the second administration of Grant, Reconstruction is already on the defensive and being attacked by Democrats, by the so-called liberal Republicans, as in not modern liberalism, but classical laissez-faire liberalism, what we call conservatism today, people who oppose government intervention in the economy. They definitely oppose Reconstruction. It's only then that I argue, after 1877 to 1890, that you can see the conquest of Western sovereignties, especially the Lakota, who were a formidable power in the West and who had delivered a crushing defeat to Custer. We all know Custer's last stand, but it's taught rather differently. It's the lost cause mythology of the West. Custer was very unsympathetic to Reconstruction, very anti-Indian, and we can see how the federal government is gradually, and the Republican Party itself is gradually changing from the party of anti-slavery and Lincoln to the party of big business and imperialism. And the conquest of the West is the first testing ground. And that test, though I see it as a colonial war, because they massacre women and children, something that European nations are doing at this time in Asia and Africa, with the rise of European imperialism. This is the high tide of Western imperialism. The United States itself, after conducting such warfare in the West against native nations. And mind you, they never did that to the Confederates. They destroyed property. Even Sherman's march was never directed at indiscriminately killing civilian populations, including women and children. So I saw them more as colonial wars of conquest, unlike Western historians who see the Civil War and the Indian Wars as part of the same project being undertaken by the national government of the United States. I argue that the attention of the United States is, and certainly the federal government moves from emancipatory goals during the Civil War and Reconstruction to more imperialist goals. And this comes to a head with the Spanish-American-Cuban War of 1898, when the United States first acquires its overseas colonies. And what's interesting is that the first thing the Supreme Court does is make sure that they say that these new colonial acquisitions of the United States, that the people of these colonial possessions will not enjoy the protections of the U.S. Constitution, including the national citizenship guarantee of the 14th Amendment. So you can see how the fall of Reconstruction is really linked to the rise of the American empire and to the changing nature of the Republican Party itself.
Thank you. Jeffrey Butwell has a question.
Sure. I think you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Sinha.
Hi.
Thanks very much for your book, which is wonderfully thought-provoking. And the comment in question I want to ask stems directly from the thinking that your book made me do about George Boutwell, my distant family member of whom I've just written a biography.
I know, I saw that. I was so happy to see that.
Thank
Because
you.
there's so many of these forgotten radical Republicans who were, heroes of their times. And I was really happy to see that. Yes, go ahead.
It was wonderful of you to mention him because, of course, not many historians up until now have mentioned him, and I hope that'll change. But the comment I want to make, and there's a question at the end of it, is that given the thought, the thinking that I've done provoked by your book in terms of imperialism in the late 1800s being a continuation of the fall of Reconstruction, a trampling of constitutional rights in the South, now being replayed overseas, I want to give you a little timeline that I think illustrates that very nicely in George Boutwell's life. And very quickly, I'll start in the 1850s. George is one of the prominent anti-slavery Republicans at the 1860 convention, so on and so forth. 1860s, emancipation and abolition. Works with Lincoln on the Emancipation Proclamation, helps craft the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, works with Grant to then in the 1870s try and protect those constitutional privileges in the South. But of course, by 1877, that's failing. Now, in 1877, George loses his re-election campaign for the Senate in Massachusetts. And I think partly because many of his constituents are just tired of Reconstruction. He's been harping on these issues for 20 years. They want to get on with the business of America being business. They want to celebrate the 200th or the 100th birthday of America in 1876. So George loses to George Frisbee Hoar, who becomes the new senator of Massachusetts. Well, for the next 20 years, George shifts his focus to international issues. And he does so with the express intention of protecting constitutional rights overseas that he sees being trampled at home. And the examples are first in the 1880s, he's hired by the Kingdom of Hawaii to represent its interests in Congress. And he is constantly advocating against America's annexation of the Hawaiian Islands. He says we can get all we want through trade and diplomacy. We don't physically occupy the Hawaiian Islands. A few years later, he is vociferously opposing America possibly going to war with Great Britain over the Venezuela boundary dispute. This didn't last long. It was a few months, but there was a real war fever in America, whipped up by the controversy between Britain and Venezuela over the border in South America with British Guyana and British territories. And George is fearful that America is going to go to war. Well, of course, that leads into the Spanish-American War. Philippines and Cuba and Puerto Rico fall into America's lap, and George becomes the president of the Anti-Imperialist League, working with Carnegie and Twain and others to oppose first McKinley and then Teddy Roosevelt in imposing America's will on 10 million Filipinos and Cubans and Puerto Ricans as well. So if you look at that kind of over a 60-year period, it really does illustrate your point that George Boutwell had moved from seeking to protect constitutional rights at home to what he sees as America trampling on constitutional rights overseas through this first vestige of American imperialism.
That's really a good point that you're making, and I wish your book had been out before I had written my book. But this is how George Boutwell caught my attention, not only for being one of the great radical Republican champions of Black rights and of freed people's rights in the South after the Civil War, but also he was one of the managers of the impeachment of Andrew Johnson for opposing Reconstruction after Lincoln's death. And then, of course, as you mentioned, his role in the Anti-Imperialist League. And this is what interested me, that most radicals like Boutwell and abolitionists like Garrison opposed imperialism. They opposed the conquest of the West, and they even shamed Sherman and Sheridan and said, you're committing war crimes the way the Confederate generals like Nathan Bedford Forrest had his notorious massacre of United States colored troops in Fort Pillow. And so these abolitionists remained true, these radicals remained true to their calling. And as the Republican Party moved to a more imperialist position, people like Boutwell, etc., said they could no longer support the Republican Party. It was no longer the party of anti-slavery, Lincoln, and Black rights. And there are a lot of current day Republicans who are running around always saying, we are the party of anti-slavery, Black rights. The Democrats were the party of the Confederacy in the slave South and of the KKK and Jim Crow. And it seemed they just missed the last 100 years of history. But a person like Boutwell chose to support William Jennings Bryan rather than McKinley because of his anti-imperialist stance, that he was principled right up to the end. And I am really flattered that I get to speak to a descendant of his. I get very excited when I meet descendants of Garrison or Boutwell. To me, they are the founders of the Second American Republic, and their vision is still being challenged today. If you look at all the controversies of the 14th Amendment over national citizenship by naturalization or birthright, conservatives are still carrying the torch of neo-Confederates in challenging those ideas. So I was very interested in him, and a lot of the sort of handful of big business people like Carnegie who joined the Anti-Imperialist League left it because of that. They felt that they had to stick by the Republican Party, which was, after all, very favorable to big business and had become, in fact, the party of robber barons during the Gilded Age. It's a legacy that continues until today. So I was very interested, as I said, in recovering these radical and abolitionist voices like Boutwell and others. And one of your questions that was sent to me by Debbie, people said, why didn't you look at the conservative side of the argument?
Mm.
And I look at people like, the Confederates who are building up the lost cause mythology of the Civil War. The war was about states' rights, had nothing to do with slavery. People like Alexander Stevens and Jefferson Davis, etc. My first book, in fact, was on pro-slavery ideology, where I had really studied Southern constitutional thinking on states' rights and their defense of slavery very deeply. And I realized I really don't like these men, and I'd rather study the abolitionists and radicals. So maybe I'm at fault at highlighting radicals like Boutwell and abolitionists more than the conservatives, but I do mention their position and mention also some of the problems and the myth making in their position, which is an aspect of US history that still haunts us today, especially those who go running around defending Confederate statues as if that represents accurate history.
Yeah. If I could just do a very quick coda, we also have to remember that there were white supremacist racists part of the anti-imperialist movement. People like Ben Pitchfork Tillman from South Carolina, who supported the anti-imperialist campaign not to annex the Philippines because somehow they thought that would open the door to
Yeah,
10.
but there was a difference between the anti-imperialism of somebody like Ben Tillman
Mhm.
and that of the principled anti-imperialism.
Yeah.
They were nervous that in fact citizenship rights would be extended to these non-white peoples all over the world. And they had conceived of American citizenship in this very blood, soil, Nazi, racist kind of fashion where it was not civic nationalism. They emphasized ethnic nationalism, that somehow only people of European descent could be citizens. They didn't even want Native Americans to be so they didn't want them to have sovereignty. They didn't even want them to have citizenship rights. And so his opposition or his anti-imperialism was deeply racist. And it's not one that defines the entire anti-imperialist move. It's the same movement. It's the same way that John C. Calhoun, who was, of course, the great defender of slavery from South Carolina before the Civil War, opposed acquiring all of Mexico. He says, we don't want all these brown people as citizens. And when the Mexican War ended, and people of Mexican descent, Hispanos, as they were called, were given citizenship rights. He didn't like that at all because he thought it was muddying the color line of American citizenship. Again, this is an idea that many people today are espousing, that somehow American citizenship is not based on civic ideals, which it always has been, but more on ethnicity and blood. And so Calhoun opposed the Mexican War. But unlike Lincoln, who opposed the Mexican War as a land grab for slavery, he opposed the Mexican War from a very racist point of view. And that's exactly where Tillman, who of course was involved in the Hamburg massacre in South Carolina that ended Reconstruction there and was a great champion of lynching Black people. That was his opposition. So I think we have to be really clear that people like Boutwell, etc., were principled opposers. And there are a lot of people who criticize the Anti-Imperialist League for being as, quote, racist as the imperialists, but that is only because of the exceptions don't prove the rule. Let's just put it that way. People like Tillman, etc., who opposed it on racist grounds.
The depth of your research on the subject prompts us to want to ask the great what if question. Given the profound racial, uh, sexist, and gender prejudices of the Reconstruction era, under what circumstances, if any, could there have been a successful integration strategy to secure broad human rights across these divides?
Yeah, as a historian, I get asked that a lot. That we've sort of moved from this myth of American exceptionalism to the polar opposite, where all of American history is like one big racist reaction. And both those ideas are simplistic and unnuanced and are actually not historically accurate. Because if you look at the period of Reconstruction, there were a lot of people then who are far ahead of some people today on issues of race and sex. If you read Margaret Fuller's writings in the 1840s on gender and gender fluidity, you would think, oh my God, is she some kind of woke modern person? Or if you look at, certainly radical Black thinkers from the moment the Republic is founded, and I mentioned them all in my previous book, The Slave's Cause, but even white abolitionists, far ahead of their peers on issues of race and Black rights. If you look at a moderate anti-slavery politician like Lincoln, who moves towards abolitionist ground, recently a website called The Unpopulist reprinted an essay I wrote in 2008 on Juneteenth on Lincoln and abolition, and it got a lot of play on social media. But I had written that a long time ago, but that still holds true. A person like Lincoln could refute racism on broad logical grounds, even though he himself, had to move from non-expansion and colonization to emancipation and eventually becoming the first US president to endorse Black citizenship and voting rights for Black men. So, you know, there were a lot of people in the 1860s, especially the radicals like Boutwell, but certainly, two of my favorites who I think are seers of modern American democracy, Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, far, far ahead. Thaddeus Stevens wanted to expropriate all the land of the slaveholders and divide them amongst emancipated slave and poor Southern white Unionists. Now, nothing Zoran Mamdani says is as radical as that. He had a plan, and a lot of freed people had that too. We look at the takeoff of the suffrage movement, and if you read some of the feminists from that time, including some who were pretty racist and elitist, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they are far ahead on the question of women's rights than some people today, So that's what I wanted to capture in my book on Reconstruction and on abolition. Don't ever say they were men and women of their times, because there were a lot of men and women, particularly people of African descent, who were challenging this and trying to broaden the boundaries of American democracy. And so if we look at what they achieved during Reconstruction, it's actually quite amazing. The fact that conservatives till today are attacking the 14th Amendment and have been unable to implement the provisions of the 14th Amendment, which would have safeguarded our democracy forevermore, tells us something. Even the 1965 Voting Rights Act says it's being passed to implement the 15th Amendment to the US Constitution, passed nearly 100 years ago in 1870. Today, if you look at the provisions of the 14th Amendment, if you have participated or incited an insurrection against the government of the United States, you can, and have, sworn to uphold the opposition Constitution, um, you can never hold federal office. That is a provision that has not been implemented. The United States Supreme Court in Trump versus or Colorado, I think it was, or even Trump versus United, they've just refused to uphold it. So they don't implement the 14th Amendment. That if you indulge in voter suppression, your state will suffer a loss in representation in Congress. That could have been implemented during the Jim Crow era. It never was. It still is. It can be implemented today in states that indulge in voter suppression. It still isn't. So there are just many provisions, and certainly the one that is most talked about today, national citizenship. And people concentrate just on birthright. But if you read that clause, it says national citizenship by naturalization or birthright. So it's really important for us to understand that the 14th Amendment was such a radical amendment to the US Constitution that it is still being disputed today. Neo-Confederates from the South say, oh, well, we were forced to ratify the 14th Amendment in order to rejoin the Union, therefore it's not legitimate. They come up with all kinds of ways to challenge the legitimacy of Reconstruction laws and amendments. And think of it, our first federal civil rights laws are passed in 1866, 1875. those are something that a lot of people who still tout, quote, states' rights are against. So it's I think important to remember that this experiment may have succeeded if the will and if the Republican Party and if the changes hadn't occurred in the North, especially with the takeoff of the Industrial Revolution that made many Northern elites very sympathetic to Southern elites complaining about Black people as being lazy and not working. They had a same labor problem in the North with mainly Southern and Eastern European immigrants whom they saw as, quote, lesser whites. They that whole alliance that brought into being Reconstruction was fraying. And so you have Southern domestic terrorism, political violence, and the waning Northern will to implement Reconstruction. So I'm very I want to emphasize those nuances and those contingencies in US history. None of this is inevitable. History is made by people who act and those who acquiesce maybe to wrongdoing at times. And we need to be able to show that, to show that nothing is inevitable. Just as US history doesn't progress in a linear way towards greater freedom and democracy, that should be evident now to everyone. It also doesn't progress only in a reactionary way. There have been moments in US history when those forces have been decisively defeated. In the Civil War, during the Second Reconstruction of American democracy, during the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Freedom Struggle. And now it seems we are ripe for a third reconstruction of American democracy.
The Supreme Court has played a significant role in setting this direction for you. Write about the civil rights cases of 1883, really setting precedents, which made it difficult to recover from in terms of individual rights in the 14th Amendment. How did that was that a potential tipping point that had the court reached a different conclusion, set us on a different course? And
hmm I think so. I think that's a really good question, and I think it was one of the questions sent to me. Is the dismal role of the United States Supreme Court in undoing federal civil rights laws and in undoing the Reconstruction amendments to the U.S. Constitution? Um, Very seldom has the Supreme Court acted in progressive ways. The Earl Warren Court that the Brown v. Board decision that got rid of or attempted to get rid of school segregation, the civil rights courts, that was a bit of an anomaly, or even some of the other progressive era courts that tried to undo some of the anti-labor decisions taken by the United States Supreme Court. Those are anomalies. On the whole, the United States Supreme Court has acted as a bastion of reaction and conservatism. You can name them: Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson. In fact, I tell my students, if you're ever running for political office and somebody asks you, what is the worst Supreme Court decision? You should be able to say Dred Scott and Plessy and tell them what it is about, because there was a recent candidate for the vice presidency who couldn't name a Supreme Court decision that you disagree with. But the Supreme Court in the late 19th century was a court that did not understand the constitutional revolution that had taken place during Reconstruction. It remained a hidebound court, even those appointed by Republican presidents, bound to old legal theories and old judicial precedents that had been actually proven to be wrong. And this is how they built on one bad decision after another. They create their own sort of precedent. Though when it comes to expanding rights, as we saw in the Dobbs decision, they don't hesitate to, violate judicial precedent. So there is the only governing idea has been as a whole to restrict rights. And during the late 19th century, the 1883 civil rights courts cases that declared the 1875 Civil Rights Act unconstitutional. That was an act that would have outlawed Jim Crow before it was founded in the southern states. That paved the way, it gave the green light to the South to institute Jim Crow, and it paved the way to Plessy versus Ferguson, where the United States Supreme Court said it's okay, you're not violating the Constitution. Similarly, they issued Williams versus Mississippi in 1898 that said it's okay for you to violate the 15th Amendment and get rid of black male voters as long as you don't explicitly mention race, which of course the southern states proceeded to do with literacy laws, grandfather clause, if you can vote only if your grandfather voted. And that, by the way, resulted in defeat for democracy, not just for black people, but all Southerners. A lot of Southern whites lost the right to vote under those disfranchisement decisions. So yes, the Supreme Court has not played a very good role in upholding the changes. And if you look at the present day Supreme Court, starting with decisions like the Heller decision that completely misinterpreted the Second Amendment as an unrestricted individual right to carry guns wherever you wanted, goes completely against the Constitution, and against the notion of a well-regulated militia that is mentioned specifically in the Second Amendment. But also Citizens United, also decisions as in Shelby County versus Holder, that gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. The Supreme Court today resembles a lot the post-Reconstruction Supreme Court, and they did play a very important role in undermining Reconstruction, and in undermining the U.S. Constitution itself, and allowing people to undermine the U.S. Constitution. So I do not hold the Supreme Court in as a sacrosanct authority. They are supposed to be the last word and to uphold the U.S. Constitution. And interestingly, it's federal district court judges who are doing that more than the Supreme Court. And that's exactly what would happen during the fall of Reconstruction. Federal district courts would uphold the right to vote for black men. And by the time it got to the Supreme Court, as in the case of Reese, etc., they would take it away and they would misinterpret the Constitution. So, it's important for us. I have great admiration for all those who would uphold our constitutional order, including judges, ordinary American citizens, because the United States Supreme Court is failing signally to do that, and failed to do that. And in fact, so misinterpreted the Reconstruction laws and amendments that it facilitated the overthrow of Reconstruction.
Another of our authors, David Kent, has a question.
One of the things that became obvious to me, and I don't know that you explicitly say this in your book, but it becomes obvious through the book, and something you just said reminded me of it, is that you really have two groups of people. You have the abolitionists, the women's rights advocates, the civil rights advocates, the gay rights advocates. These are people who kind of stand away from the crowd and work towards bringing the Constitution to comply. Basically, it applies to everyone, all Americans. And then you have, which unfortunately I think is the larger force, which is a more wealthy, the white, the male. They are the ones who control things, and they are the ones who have all of the rights, and they get to choose what other rights or what people have rights. And so that, I think, goes all the way through your book. It goes from the beginning of the country, it goes to today, obviously. And I wonder if it makes much sense to say, well, the Republicans shifted from being anti-slavery to being more big business, to more imperialistic and things like that, which is absolutely true. And you make you make that case. But the reality is that they were doing this in a context of a reality of a context in which the South, in particular, but conservative forces in the North and the South were totally being anti-American as far as, the Constitution applies to all of us. And
Yeah.
that continues with what you were saying with the 14th Amendment and how people are still fighting what that means. So to me, it's sort of like, well, the problem isn't that liberal, progressive, Lincoln
Mm.
Republican forces aren't doing enough. It's that the other side is glutton control, and they do control. They have the control, and it kind of parlays into the question of when did the South and the conservative forces really regain control of the federal government, the Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court, and how much did that really influence where the Republican Party at that time, by this time, Grant's Republican Party, where they began to shift?
That's such an interesting question, David, and I think it gets to the crux of U.S. history, which I've always, I call it the great contest in this book between progressive forces and reactionary forces, and it's always been like that. It seems to kind of reinvent itself. This notion that somehow now we reached a stage where we no longer go to the bad old days. Well, yes, maybe we don't have slavery anymore, but we do have people who subscribe to the ideas of those people who upheld uh, those kinds of ideas. My students are always stunned when I tell them that when the American Republic was founded, citizenship was not necessarily linked to voting. That many times our Constitution refers to persons, not even citizens, because they want those rights to be broad-based. Um, but that in the early American Republic, a lot of propertied Black men could vote, and they continued to vote in most New England states except Connecticut right up to the Civil War. So this notion that only white men could vote, it's true that they were the dominant group, is not necessarily accurate. And there's always been a fight in this country between civic notions of nationalism and ethnic notions of nationalism. There were many nativist Protestant Americans who didn't want Catholics in the 1840s. We had the Know Nothing Party that emerged after the demise of the Whig Party as an opposition to the Democratic Party before the Republican Party. And they opposed Irish and German Catholics coming into this country. Later on, nativism was against Southern and Eastern Europeans and Jewish people coming into the country, Slavic people coming into the country. And so, it's always been there as a facet, but we've always had those ideals that Lincoln always upheld. Whether he upheld the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, of universal human equality, it had no qualifier. It did not say men or white men. I mean, it used man to mean the human race. It had a concept of universal individual human rights from the Enlightenment. Those civic ideas are embedded in the best portions of our Constitution. And the portions that were regrettable, the ones that were compromises over slavery, the Three-Fifths Clause, the Fugitive Slave Clause, the African Slave Trade Clause that allowed it to continue until 1808, all those are redundant and have been done away with. So I think it's really important for us today, especially, to think of the Constitution in those broad civic ideals. I was just in Europe, and what distinguishes the United States from many of the old world European countries is that citizenship is acquired by fealty to the ideals of American republicanism. It's not acquired because of an ethnicity. And certainly now not acquired only for men, but or it's not restricted by gender. And today we associate the right to vote with citizenship too. That's linked. I think all those people who have opposed these are essentially anti-democratic people. How did the South win? I mean, I write in my book that the South may have lost the war, but they won the peace
Right.
eventually.
Well,
Because
that's
what the South wanted, they were, in 1874, the congressional elections of 1874, the Democrats were back in power in the House of Representatives, and many former Confederates were chair of many of the leading congressional committees. The Supreme Court in the early 20th century, a member of the White League of Louisiana, which was a Ku Klux Klan kind of organization that perpetrated racist violence against Black people, became the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So, the South won the peace for sure, I would
yeah.
say.
I
You
think
know,
that's a good point with the civic idea because I think it's only like 30% of Americans born here could pass the citizenship tests that's
yes,
required of immigrants trying to become citizens.
absolutely. In fact, when I did my immigration test, my naturalization test, it was in the 1990s. Bill Clinton was the president, I remember. And I took the test and I found an inaccuracy in the book that they gave us to learn because I taught US history. And I said, you said that the Voting Rights Act is passed in 1970. It was actually passed in 1965. I told the immigration guy who was interviewing me, and he was stunned, and I pointed it out to him, and he asked me, and then he started talking about me. He didn't ask me any other question except my entire life story and how I came to teach US history.
Yeah, well,
I came
when
out.
the person taking the test knows more than the person giving the test.
And he was just, poor guy, was an immigration agent just doing his job.
Yeah,
He didn't
yeah.
know that the booklet was wrong. And when I came out, my husband said, they'll definitely fail you because you pointed an error. But at that time, they didn't. And this is what being a principled member of the federal government would mean. If you were in an authoritarian regime where they can bend the truth and they whatever they say is correct, whether they're lying or whether it's based on fact, then maybe I would have been failed for that immigration test. But at that time, they were still uh, civil servants dedicated to upholding the actual Constitution and the rule of law. But that's my funny immigration story.
On another
That's good.
issue,
Yeah.
on another issue,
Oh,
uh,
sorry.
you uh, you lament the separation of the feminist movement from the Black civil rights movement. Do you think that the women would have achieved the right to vote in the early 20th century if they had stayed united with Black rights?
I think they would have actually achieved the right to vote earlier if they had not separated on that issue. When they separated on that issue, and you had the split of the suffrage movement into two wings, the American Women's Suffrage Association, where most African American women who continued to link Black rights and women's rights went, and those who went with Katie Stanton and Anthony, the National Women's Suffrage Association, that opposed the 14th and 15th Amendment to the US Constitution. That was a big mistake. The only people willing to advocate a 16th Amendment were the radical Republicans like George Julian, who first introduced it on the House floor in 1869. The split in the suffrage movement meant that until they reunited in 1890, that's when it really takes off. And then they get the 19th Amendment passed in 1920. And the tragedy is that it is passed in the face of the downfall of Reconstruction. And so they end up not enfranchising Black women in the South, who nonetheless try to vote under the 19th Amendment, but who are sent away from the polls. So I think it delayed for sure the suffrage amendment, the split in the suffrage movement. I think it was too expedient. They said we would rather have locals of Southern white women than listen to Black women's concerns about lynching and segregation. And so they kowtowed to some of these Southern white elite women who had, segregated suffrage conventions in the South. But if you look at the states that, excuse me, actually passed the 19th Amendment, with a few exceptions, most Southern states were against it. And Southern congressmen and senators were the leaders of the anti-suffragist movement. David asked about the significance of the fact that these Southerners were back in Congress. They became a solid reactionary majority that opposed not just Black rights, but women's rights and labor rights. Till today, the union movement hasn't found its footing in the South uh, because of that history. It's not until the civil rights movement when the so-called Dixiecrats from the Democratic Party moved to the Republican Party, that we, don't have this, sort of solid. It was called the Solid South for one reason. It was a solid reactionary bloc in the federal government. They made sure that the New Deal programs would not extend to Black Southerners and would be administrated in racially discriminatory ways. They are now a solid red bloc in the Republican Party today, which of course Lincoln is turning in his grave right now. But he didn't get a single vote from the South. And so, I mean, electoral vote, I should qualify. He did get some votes from Southern Unionists. So, it's really it's a tragedy that this reactionary, and this is why I think Reconstruction is so significant in US history, because we are still living with its political legacies. Ed had a question. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for doing this for us. It's great. I was wondering, I think you referred to this obliquely before, but after every period of so-called progressive legislation, starting with Lincoln and the Republican Congress during the Civil War, and then the progressive era under Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson, and then the New Deal, and then the Great Society, the voters react against it. Is it because there's one school of thought, I think, is that people are just kind of exhausted by all this change and all this new programs, and they turn to conservatism, or is it because they're reacting against it? But interestingly, the programs that were enacted, like under Lincoln, nobody's going to say, let's do away with land grant colleges or the Department of Agriculture. So all those reforms stay in place, but then people vote against the very party, the very people who brought them these programs, these changes. Why
Yeah.
do
Yeah, that's a really $1 million question. It's a great question. It's a lot of historians subscribe to the backlash theory in American history, that there's always kind of a racist backlash to any progress that is made on Black rights, but even if we think on progressive legislation and the development of the modern liberal state. And I think it's not inevitable. I don't think it's that voters are tired of things or anything like that. It's just that that there's always been, even at the height of these programs, even at the height of the New Deal, at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, there was always a reactionary opposition to it, a conservative opposition to it. And these people are able to sell their message either by appealing to voters who feel left out of these programs, or trying to scapegoat people, saying, well, like what Andrew Johnson did. This is a classic framing that still goes on today, that if you extend rights to other people, then you're taking away rights from white Americans, as if rights is a finite resource that, if you give it to other people, then some people will have less of it, rather than an equalizing thing. And so I do think that the opposition is always there. And sometimes even liberals, I'm thinking of modern liberals, progressives, get complacent. They think, oh, the battles have been won. Oh, we abolished slavery. So who's going to introduce convict lease labor systems and debt peonage that push people to as close a state to slavery as possible? Or they say, oh, we've established the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Education. Who's going to do away with it? Or look at the public school systems that come from the common school systems of New England from the colonial era, but really arise in the 19th century and are introduced in the South only during Reconstruction, when the South doesn't even have a public school system. They've hated the public school system since. and they've hated the Department of Education since. And it was founded in the 1970s. And so we feel as if these victories have been won, and that people are just tired of it. No, they're not. If you ask people, are you for Social Security? They'll say yes. But then they'll say, are you against big government? They'll say yes. They don't make those connections. And, I hate to sound old-fashioned, but I really think that in order to save our republic, we need basic history, civics, and lessons being taught to all American citizens, because that's what the founding fathers actually feared, was an ill-informed or misinformed citizenry. I recently did a documentary with the Lincoln Presidential Foundation on his famous Lyceum speech from 1837, where he warned, he said, if we lose our republic, it will not be because of some foreign invader. It will be because of the rise of a Napoleon-like figure within the United States, a tyrant who will mislead the people. And, if you read his speech, it's as if, it's timeless. It's something we could read today. So I do think that a lot of the backlash comes from very savvy politicians like Nixon, like Trump, making use of racial resentment, appealing not as Lincoln did to the better angels of our nature, but to the worst passions of our nature. And, they use it it's an old-fashioned divide and rule sort of tactic. I think a lot of people do wake up when their ideas are actually implemented. You may be against the federal government, but you need FEMA when you have a disaster. You may be against the federal government, but you need public school systems. You may be a billionaire who doesn't want to pay his taxes, but really it's the federal government and the structure that has been put into place that has made your billions and millions possible. And I think a lot of people can't look beyond their nose. And it's not just ordinary voters, it's even the so-called billionaire classes, that they would do anything that would consciously destroy the United States government or destroy our economy. It shows how short-sighted people can be. And this is just a very basic tenet of American republicanism with a small r, the ability to put the common good before your short-term self-interests is something that all good citizens should have. It was called virtue in those days, not as in morality, but as political virtue. We need to get back to basics virtually, I think. And I think that's why these things happen. And again, I don't think it's inevitable. I don't think it's always. It's so happened that it has, in the United States, you see the rise and fall and the ups and downs constantly. But I don't think it's necessarily inevitable. History is not doomed to repeat itself.
We have time for one more question, I think, and
Yeah.
Samir Samal has a question.
Thank you, John. Dr. Sinha, so nice to have you here. I'd be remiss not to acknowledge the legacy of your father, General Sinha, and the work he did for Nepal. And, I think many of us, being a little bit obsessive about Mr. Lincoln, we can always fantasize about what would have happened. And I know you can probably provide great context on that. And I appreciate the question earlier, which allowed me to move on from that. But Lincoln was Lincoln, who he was. So there's no doubt it would have been an easier assimilation and progress because of his work as an executive, because of what he'd accomplished, and because of his evolution as a human being and as president and as somebody who really understood, because of his benevolence, what was needed to take place. At the same time, I think that you could probably comment as well as anyone on the progress that did take place in terms of Reconstruction. When you think about, just an example in General Longstreet, and I know you mentioned 74 and the Battle of Liberty Place, maybe you can just comment on a few people that it would have been very easy for somebody like General Longstreet and others to not take a stand and join hands with Grant and the government. And because of that, there was progress that was made. So anything you can share about him or anyone else from the South that, would be helpful.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And thanks for the kind words about my father. His biggest legacy was to make sure that the Indian Army was apolitical. He wrote a lot on that because he saw the newly independent nations in the global South right to, fall to military dictatorships. And his big achievement in his life was to make sure that the Indian Army remained apolitical, that you do not politicize the armed forces, which astonishingly, I think we have to relearn that lesson today in the United States. So his ideas remain present with me today. And then, of course, he was ambassador to Nepal and governor of two states and later in his life. But this question that you asked about, the possibility to change, to evolve. I mean, Lincoln, is one of those people who was not an abolitionist, but who was sincerely anti-slavery from the start. You look at his speeches from when he was an unknown lawyer and a state legislator, and the abolitionists are really unpopular in Illinois at that time. And he, takes a stance against the lynching of abolitionists and the killing of even enslaved people during slave insurrection scares in Mississippi. Now, that's a pretty bold stance to take for a young, unknown, ambitious politician in the 1830s in Illinois, which had black laws that, did not allow black people to even immigrate into the state without posting a bond. Um, there were a lot of Southerners who made that transition, and those are the Southerners to admire. Not Lee, Robert E. Lee, who opposed Reconstruction, opposed Black rights right up to the bitter end, but somebody like Longstreet, who made that transition. There was another Virginian general who led a reconciliation with Black people and actually formed a fusion government, the readjuster government in Virginia in the 1880s. So there were Confederates who, quote, saw the error of their ways, and their transition was even more remarkable than that of Lincoln, because Lincoln was a man of anti-slavery conviction, but who revered the Union and the Constitution. So unlike the abolitionists who said no, like somebody like Garrison who said no union with slaveholders, burn the fugitive slave clause of the U.S. Constitution, Lincoln would never do that. He always balanced his loyalties to the Union, the Constitution, and his anti-slavery principles. The Civil War freed him from doing that because Southern slaveholders committed treason and destroyed the Union. And he was able to act, I think, on his long-held anti-slavery convictions. But more remarkable is the transition of Southerners, Confederates like Longstreet, who, as I said, realized that, as Grant said it, they fought for the worst cause in human history to enslave other people. And there's a reason why you don't find many statues of Longstreet in the South. All those Confederate monuments that I think should be taken down because they were traitors to the Republic fighting for slavery, and they're maintained by taxpayer dollars. Why should any person of African descent or any ethical American citizen want their taxpaying dollars to actually commemorate these men? I would, personally contribute to a statue of Longstreet, but you don't find that. And in the Lost Cause mythology, they ended up blaming Longstreet for Lee's failure at Gettysburg, right? They put all the blame on Longstreet when in fact it was a massive error of strategy on the part of Longstreet, on the part of Lee. So, there are many Southerners, white Southerners, who did the right thing. There were Southern Unionists, they were called Lincoln's Loyalists, who fought in the Union Army. They were the heroes of America. There were Southern Unionists. These are the people Thaddeus Stevens said we should reward. So it was not just a black and white thing, but the South made it into a black and white thing. During the height of Jim Crow and the one-drop rule and all those ideas about race. This is the height of the pseudoscience of race and social Darwinism. Um, there are many Southern whites that we can commemorate today that don't have to be Confederates, and Confederates who until the end remained diehard apologists for
Our,
the Confederacy.
our group has discussed Amos Ackerman, a
Yeah,
Confederate
he was
cavalryman from Georgia who was Grant's.
originally from New Hampshire, but yes, eventually Georgia.
He fought for the South.
He fought for the South. He fought for the Confederate, but he was an amazing attorney general. And you know what he says. I quote him in, I think, in the book. He says when he finally leaves office, he says what really saddened him was to see the level of brutality of Southern whites during Reconstruction, because he was investigating all these, um, cases of barbaric violence against Black people. And he says his heart was sickened. He couldn't understand that these people could even call themselves Christians. And, as Robert Elliott, the Black Reconstruction politician, put it, pray who's the barbarian here. But Ackerman's, words when he resigned on the white South, I think should be read by 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 everyone.
Professor Sinha, thank you very much for spending this time with us this morning. We've exceeded the time you've allowed us. We greatly appreciate not only your time today, but the book that you wrote. We have enjoyed discussing it, discovering much about American history through your efforts. Thank you very much.